We're here to talk about probably what is one of the most hot topics that is around in finance at the moment, and that's the HEM, household expenditure measure, and how that sits out there in terms of customer identified living expenses. There's been a lot of talk around the industry over recent times, and it's not only around the NCCP that's been around for quite a while, but it's around the scutterbug in terms of regulatory oversight, the Royal Commission, and those sorts of issues. They've been very topical. We'll look at HEM and CILE, Customer Identified Living Expenses, and the differences between the two. We'll discuss lenders' servicing policies as far as we can, and Connective's requirements. So in the area of making reasonable inquiries about borrowers' financial positions. Finally, we'll give you some hints as to some of the best practice methods of collecting and verifying household living expenses. So there are things that you can do to better manage that process. So regulatory requirements and oversight. The need to deal with HEM has come about from a couple of areas, and it dates back even to the point of implementation of the National Credit Code back in 2010, July 2010. And there's been a lot of noise around HEM and CILE at the moment and in recent times. But I can remember being part of the implementation of all the NCCP frameworks back in 2009-10, and in meetings at that time, even meetings that attended at Gaydon's and other lawyers at the time, HEM, not so much HEM, but HPI, the Henderson Poverty Index, became an issue in the early days with ASIC and particularly APRA having concerns about using benchmarks in servicing calculators, which had been going on for some time pre-2010, 2009, and not actually drilling down into the expense categories of living expenses. And that's boiled away in the background over the last 6 or 7 years, in that APRA have, of recent times, been putting pressure on the banks to use customer identified living expenses to calculate servicing rather than just using a benchmark. The HEM benchmark has been seen, or has become seen, as being light on when talking about expenses that are actual in people's lives. So we've got the responsible lending provisions of the NCC Act, where we have to make reasonable inquiries, brokers have to make reasonable inquiries as to consumers' financial positions. And that talks about, ascertaining income, actual income and expenses, making sure the proposed credit being suitable for the client's needs and objectives. And the term actually is in reverse, making sure it's not unsuitable, making sure the credit is not unsuitable. APRA's regulation of the banks and come down to it, ASICs of the non-bank credit providers, and brokers and aggregators all fall under that non-bank sector. They've been focusing on responsible lending for some time, and in my history, my employment history, coming from other mortgage managers and the like, and dealing in responsible lending, I can tell you firsthand that APRA has been very active in the lending circles, in the major four, and in other banks as well, the secondary level banks, in making sure that the responsible lending provisions of the credit code are being complied with. And we've all seen a lot of paperwork come out over the last 12, 18 months in terms of needs and objectives and the like. The Royal Commission of recent times, for those that have been able to have a look at it online, it's actually been very interesting viewing. The major four banks have all been called up as witnesses in 4 test cases that I had a look at, and there's been a lot of media focus from the Royal Commission proceedings, and it's been focused about advice, credit advice. It's been focused on introduction of lending through introducers, through brokers, and different forms of the ability to give credit advice in those areas. We've seen a predominance of non-compliance come out of those test cases with the banks, and a focus on brokers and credit advice being given by brokers. So there's a lot of spotlights out there at the moment around responsible lending and reg compliance requirements. If we look at the Royal Commission proceedings in March, as I said, there's been 4 main cases that I've seen that have related to lending and financial services in the banking arena. And on the 24th of March, the closing submissions of the counsel assisting the Commissioner asserted, in particular, there was one case I looked at, and I've used it here as an example, of a bank failing to comply with the NCCP responsible lending requirements. I noticed in the transcriptions that a certain bank was asserted to have failed to comply with the Regulatory Guide Obligations 209, credit licensing and responsible lending conduct, and that said bank had breached its statutory obligations under the National Credit Act to do all things necessary to ensure that the credit activities that they were engaged in efficiently, honestly and fairly. And most particularly, it breached sections of the Act where it had not made reasonable inquiries about the customer's financial situation in accordance with Section 130 of the Act. It had not taken reasonable steps to verify the customer's financial position in accordance with the Act, and it had not made an assessment about whether the credit contract would not be unsuitable to the customers. So they're pretty critical to the issues around responsible lending that we're looking at in whether to apply or why the banks have applied HEM in the past, and should we apply the customer identified living expenses, which is where all this is heading, I suppose, in the background. Just digging a little more deeply into the responsible lending obligations, the reg requirements of the NCCP Act require credit providers, lenders, and credit assistance providers, which is brokers and credit representatives, to make reasonable inquiries. I would recommend, for those that haven't done so yet, for new to industry brokers, to brokers who have not been around a long time, to have a look at the ASIC website and have a look at the regulatory guides that are contained in there. They give a breakdown, or if you like, a layman's point of view around requirements of the Act. I wouldn't recommend a lot of people look at the Act itself, because it is like a lot of legislation. It's a lot of legalese, But the reg guides, particularly Reg Guide 209 and 205, give the layperson or somebody that needs a little bit of advice and background, details about what their responsibilities are in terms of providing credit assistance, and inquiries that are reasonable to make in order to meet their responsible lending obligations. Reg Guide 209 is very good with that. Making reasonable inquiries involves obtaining information about a consumer's actual income and their expenses and any other circumstances that may likely affect their ability to meet all financial obligations without substantial hardship. So that's the point here. What we're doing in talking with our clients and providing credit advice is trying to make sure that in taking account of all facts and figures about a borrower's situation, that we're verifying or obtaining the information and verifying what their income, expenses and personal financial situation is. What inquiries should you make? As a credit licensee, Connective's developed a living expenses section within its needs analysis questionnaire that aligns with industry standards of living expense categories, as agreed to by LICSI members. Now, for those that aren't sure about what LICSI is in particular an industry body or an industry company that has been formed to provide members direction on what issues they should be including in their servicing and online platforms. So what we're talking about there is LICSI makes direction, if you like, or recommendations which the industry has adopted in terms of particularly living expenses. We'll talk about the LICSI thing in a little more depth shortly. Rounding out the responsible lending obligations, if we're looking at regulators' focus around responsible lending conduct, the rules relating to making reasonable inquiries require brokers to obtain what are the clients or the applicant's needs and objectives and what their financial situation is. So what you'll find in Reg Guide 209 is the need to, I suppose, expand out our inquiries to ensure that we ask the right questions around needs and objectives and obtaining their actual income and living expenses. The Act goes on to talk about taking reasonable steps to ascertain and verify, and the verification piece is very important. One of the problems, and I suppose some of us may have heard a term bandied around liar loans, and that has come out of discussions within the Royal Commission. And what liar loans are basically are clients misstating or deliberately putting in income and expenses that are not true. And there was some media today that I saw in The Age, which was talking about banks in particular and liar loans, where the processes within the banks of verifying whether or not what was being put into loan applications was truthful, are falling short of the mark. That you know, not only banks, but in some situations, you know, brokers are even falling short of the verification responsibilities in terms of verifying income and expenses. So again, there's a lot of press going around about that. Banks have for some time required brokers and applicants to complete attestations around clients' needs and objectives, their current and proposed financial situation, whether there's any foreseeable changes in income, expense, or their employment. I think we've all seen different forms of these requirements coming out from different banks. You know, we have a responsibility under the code to explain the features and benefits of certain products, whether there's conflicts of interest in brokers dealing with clients, and the costs and imposts, if they are there, of refinancing loans from one place to another, one bank to another. That's why we have the needs analysis that is in Mercury, and the processes of running a needs analysis, which does also contain provision for obtaining actual living expenses from the client. Taking reasonable steps is about obtaining the information about their actual income and expenses, as we've talked about. It's not only about what their current position is, but it's what their position will be, borrower's position will be, as the credit is drawn down and they go forward into the future, and what income and expenses will be applicable going into the future. One of the examples that that I draw there is first home buyers out in the market. They may be young kids living with mum and dad, and the first thing you'll hear is, well, I've got no living expenses. And as a father of late 20-year-olds at the moment who are looking for homes, I can attest to the fact that the first thing my oldest son said was that I've got no living expenses because you don't charge me any board or rent or anything for the food. But it's about taking consideration of what they will be doing when they're living in a house or a unit by themselves and paying a mortgage. Okay, looking at HEM versus custom identified living expenses, and that's what we're here for today, I suppose. We're hearing HEM bandied around all over the place. People are asking, what is HEM? Is HEM being used by the banks only to assess servicing? HEM's a benchmark, household expenditure measure. It's managed and published by the Melbourne Institute, and it's a tabular form of assessment of living expenses, and it's actually used to it's used by the Department of Statistics to do certain things, but it's certainly used by banks as a benchmark. It's a benchmark to compare a client's actual declared living expenses against. It uses an applicant's, or it assesses an applicant's size, location, various lifestyle demographics to estimate living expenses as opposed to the collection of actual living expenses. Now, probably up until the last 18 months, many of the banks, if not all of the banks, had been using in the old days HPI, Henderson Poverty Index, but more recently the household expenditure measure, to assess or to go into their servicing calculators as the assessed living expenses of a certain applicant or applicants. What APRA has looked at over recent times and backed by ASIC is that HEM is a baseline. It's virtually like the Henderson Poverty Index. It was the least amount required or assessed to be required in a certain situation of living expenses for somebody to survive. So realistically, when you sit down or a borrower sits down and has a look at everything that they pay, and that's an exercise that doesn't take just a few minutes. It's a bit of a painful exercise, but it's a very eye-opening exercise when people see how much they do spend and what the balance at the end of the day is of their income versus their expenditure. So there's been a push, definitely by APRA, and backed by ASIC, to have banks look more closely at customer identified living expenses, running a process where a broker, or in the form of banks, the personnel and staff of the banks sit down with the clients and they go through a process of identifying categories of living expenses, and it's particularly looking at living expenses in terms of the LICSI standard. Household living expenses, i.e. what we spend on a day-to-day basis, varies from household to household, and brokers have to have specific conversations with borrowers to properly identify and verify all the expenses that clients are paying in their day-to-day living. So what we've got now is, and hence why we've moved the title of this presentation from HEM, complying with the NCCP Act, but to customer identified living expenses, because they're going to be far more and continuing focus on customer identified, or identifying with your customers what their actual expenses are. HEM's basically not acknowledged by regulators now as being reasonably indicative of clients' living expenses across all household situations. And that's therefore why we've now got to focus on customer identified expenses. What is HEM? What are the LICSI standard categories? The slide I've got up now has been extracted from the LICSI website, and you'll find, if you look at the needs analysis in Mercury and the printout that comes out of the preliminary assessment or fact finds, that these are the categories that you need to run through and ask questions about. And they're putting aside fixed debt commitments like loans and credit cards and the like, leases. They're all particular questions in an application form in regards to income and outgo. But what we're talking about here are reasonably, particularly with young families, what are we looking at? Childcare. We all know how much childcare is costing people who have to have both husband and wife, mum and dad working. They're extraordinary measures of, in excess of $100 a day for childcare. What do we spend on average for clothing, education, public? Not so much, but private education fees are exorbitant nowadays, and there's a great push by a lot of people to send their kids to private school. Groceries, what do we spend on food and meat and veggies as we're trying to feed growing kids? I won't go through all the categories, but you can see up on screen, when you take into account all these 13 categories, that the HEM measure will generally get absorbed very quickly by a customer identified assessment of living expenses. I'll just refer to another thing I saw this morning on LinkedIn. It was an MFAA member group article, and a lot of you are members of LinkedIn and the MFAA will have seen it. And it was a member talking about banks assessing living expenses in regards to investment and investment loans. You'll see that in the past, the old adage of taking rental income at 80%, well, I'm taking allowance of the costs of having an investment property. But the article and the basis of the article I saw this morning was questioning why banks are now looking at assessment of customer identified living expenses where there is a rental property and an investment loan, having to include in your living expenses assessment the costs of that rental property in regards to rates and water and all those other issues. But the question the article writer had was, why are the banks not allowing us to assess rental at 100%? if we're having to add into our living expenses the cost of having that rental property? Well, the answer to that is that a lot of the lenders are doing different things. And in fact, some of the lenders are allowing lesser reductions than 20% on rental income, but having to include in your living expenses the costs of the rental property. All I can say in response to that is that it'll depend lender to lender on what their policies are in regards to assessing customer identified living expenses and rental properties. And realistically, you're probably best to look at each lender individually and have a chat to their BDM or to your broker sales manager as we move through that, because that certainly will change as we move forward into the land of identifying the living expenses.
Just to cut in for a minute there, Steve, Paul Palmer here. We're getting quite a lot of questions coming through now. What we'll do is I'll keep a list of them as we go. When Steve's finished the presentation, as time permits, we'll try and cover some of the questions, but as Steve said at the start of the presentation, we will issue frequently asked questions with responses to all of the questions asked in the webinar today. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. And look, I suppose the purpose of this exercise is to bring to the fore the use of HEM and customer identified living expenses. There's going to be a lot of questions that come out of these sorts of seminars or webinars, and we will address all questions as they come through in frequently asked questions, or maybe at the end we'll try and address some of the questions, as Paul said. If we move into section 3 today, the lender policies and connective requirements. Just a couple of things here that I've put up in the presentation around lender policies and connective requirements. So why are there differences between lenders' living expenses policies? So you might go to one lender and they're asking for individual categories of living expenses, customer identified expenses to be put through. Others will just ask for a total. Up until recent times, and particularly as we saw in the Royal Commission, some lenders, one or two, were only applying HEM. So there was little focus on customer identified living expenses. I can tell you that post the Royal Commission, those banks that aren't calling for actual living expenses, customer identified, they will be or have changed their policies. Some lenders have continued to rely on the HEM in their servicing calculators solely, rather than to move to the customer identified methods. Question 2, what should I do as a connective credit representative to comply with the responsible lending requirements of the code? So, as I've said and alluded to earlier, Connective requires its credit representatives to complete the needs analysis and therein ask questions around the 13 categories of the household expenditure to determine what borrowers' actual living expenses are. Now, you know, the code talks about face-to-face interviews with clients, and that should be the first point of call when you're doing these things. Sitting down with your clients and running through the categories and asking questions, getting the clients to think about what are they actually paying out. In a lot of cases, we don't know and haven't got a finger on the pulse of what we're paying out the door. And that's why a lot of people get into a lot of trouble with repayment of loans, and particularly repayment of credit cards. You know, over the last half a dozen years, if not more, but certainly since GFC in 2007-8, credit cards have become a way of paying for our day-to-day expenses in a lot of cases. And that's why we're seeing over recent years families with multiple credit cards, with multiple limits, and running on getting new credit cards to pay out the old credit cards, and balance payouts and all those sorts of things. And to some extent, consumers are just putting their household expenses on the never never. So when they actually sit down and look at what their living expenses are, a lot of people are shocked. So it's a good exercise to go through, with regards to applicants, so they actually see what they need to do going forwards to reduce their debt and to pay off loans. Whereas, the propensity has been over time to just put our living onto a credit card. So going through that process of the needs analysis, you can actually even download links to put into your emails out to clients to have them complete the needs analysis expenses piece. So if you're looking to do that at some stage, to alleviate the process or reinforce the process you've been talking to your clients about face to face, give us a call, either Paul or myself, and we'll tell you how to do that. Living expenses, we're talking about verification as well. Not only putting down in these worksheets the living expense categories, but we've got to go through a process of verifying them. And that can be hard work in terms of what do we get to verify. We all should know that it was one of Connective's policies to get 3 months transaction statements. A lot of banks are making that a requirement. With pays going into and salaries going into transaction accounts, we should be able to verify incomes that are stated in our loan applications and the expenses that we're putting down in the needs analysis. Things like utility bills, rates bills, all those sorts of things. We are going to have to, if we're not already, start collecting those or verifying the amounts that we're putting down in the needs analysis for expenses, the amounts from these accounts and these bills. There are things like bankstatements.com. There's a few other ones that are floating around. One or two that we'll come to on additional slides. In terms of what you can, facilities you can purchase or online capabilities to gain access to clients' bank statements by authority from the client, of course. How do I assess whether HEM or customer identified expenses will apply to servicing for a lender? So the best way that I've found is in Mercury, when you're completing the borrowing capacity calculator, you need to put a living expense figure in there. And that living expense has to be your CILE. So the process of assessing a loan for a client, you'll be doing a borrowing capacity calculator. And as you'll see on the next slide, you have to load in the total CILE figure. And what will happen is that the calculator will assess the greater of HEM or the CILE figure. So what will come out in the recommendations for each of the lenders will be either the greater of HEM or the CILE figure. And of course, if you see a figure in there that is not the figure you entered, then it's applying HEM to that calculation. And you probably need to ask whether that's appropriate for your situation. And if so, you then need to put some mitigating notes to your lender on file. The fourth question here is what do I do if CILE is less than HEM? That's what I've just talked about, is that most lenders require the individual CIL to be entered into AOL, and we require it into Mercury. Where it's less than HEM, you need to include commentary around why it is less than HEM. And look, some people's expenses will come up less than HEM. But I suppose what the lenders and what we're looking for is there a trend for brokers' applications to be coming up with amounts less than HEM and just HEM applying? And of course, that can be a falsehood if we really get down to it with looking at what a client's expenses actually are. just a screen print here, and it's just demonstrating what comes up in one of the sections of the borrowing capacity calculator. As you can see, the inputs that are calculating the different amounts of loans that a bank will lend under their policies. You've got in there uncommitted incomes, assessment rates, term in months, and this living expenses piece. Now, that will either come out as your CILE or your HEM. So be careful in having a look at that, because that will prompt you to ask questions around what you've done with collecting your living expenses figure, if that is the HEM figure coming up there. Okay, just some best practices as we go into the back end of the presentation. Ask your client, sit down and talk to your client. Incorporate into your needs analysis questionnaire or fact find the list of living expense categories that aligns with the industry standard. So that is basically what Connective have got in their needs analysis, and in the fact find or preliminary assessment is the categorized LICSI standard. And that's what you need to be talking to your client about. Connective's credit representative must complete a needs analysis questionnaire for all clients. Now, I'm talking a lot here about Connective's credit representatives. We have a responsibility and to our credit representatives provide tools for you to do all this. And the Connective credit representatives have a responsibility to utilize those tools in collecting all the information they need to submit an application. Provide guidance. That's what it's all about. That's what we're all about here in being a credit representative and a broker, is providing credit assistance. So confirm with your client why we need to accurately identify all household living expenses. A lot of clients will say, well, why does it matter? Well, it matters because at the end of the day, we've got to comply with the law to provide proper credit assistance to the clients in terms of the NCC. And it's important for them so that they know at the end of the day what the baseline is that they'll have in their pocket each month, each fortnight, each week, once they've paid all their bills and their loans. The one thing we don't want to be doing and can't do is provide an unsuitable product, and particularly knowingly provide an unsuitable product. And if you go through all these steps, there's no way you can't know what the bottom line is for a particular client. Ensure that the client's understanding of who within the family, apart from the applicants, are considered dependents. I've had questions before come through from brokers where they say, well, I've got an adult child still living at home. He's 40 years old and he doesn't pay any board and I can't get rid of him, blah, blah, blah. You still have to consider them a dependent, because basically as a mum and dad, or even single mums and dads, they are providing for that person at mature age. So you have to make an assessment of whether elderly mum living with the daughter and son-in-law or son and daughter-in-law, whether they are a dependent. And if so, you've got to add those into the living expenses. Paul? No?
Sorry, I was just laughing at one of the
Sorry.
responses about your 40-year-old dependent being called a leech here.
I tell that to my 28-year-old son. Yeah, we've all got an opinion on what we should be doing with our kids. Ensure you make it clear that when completing the living expense, the client must consider not only the living expenses they're now paying, and I've said this before, but the nature and amount of all living expenses they'll have to pay when the loan's drawn down and the loan's settled. A lot of people don't think about that. They like to just think of what they're paying now. I'm going for the loan now. That's all you should take account of. No, it's future monies as well. Particularly important for first home buyers. Hugely important. Have having gone through that most recently with my eldest son, they know very little nowadays about what it takes to buy a house, particularly in Sydney, and repay loans whilst trying to do all the things that they do nowadays as youngsters, go overseas and have trips interstate and all this sort of stuff. It's a real eye-opener. As we've got at the bottom of this slide, one helpful hint, the ASIC Money Smart website includes budget planners and a lot of really good tools. I don't generally promote government assistance and tools that they've put out in the past, but the Money Smart website is excellent. So there's a link there that you can all use. Moving along quickly, and we're nearly at the end of the presentation, but verifying CLIE. During your interview with the client to facilitate a conversation to their estimate of living expenses, they will have or will have within each category. Money Smart Budget Planner is a good tool, but I come back to the needs analysis tool.
Can I just pose a question to you here that's really a hot topic of discussion, Steve? Discretionary versus non-discretionary expenses. And can we allow for the change of lifestyle potentially when you're buying a property for the first time?
In my point of view, I would be putting down or assessing most living expenses. If you're paying it or you have to pay it, and this goes to the example of first home buyers, if you're going to have to pay an expense after you draw the loan down and get your house, or you're paying it now, it's not discretionary. You have to pay it. Realistically, if you sit down and try to assess a new or first home buyer's expenses, going forward, their expense regime has to be different to what it is before they have a loan in a house. And that's a discussion you may find hard to have with youngsters around the mid-20s. But certainly when you're talking to second and third time lenders, investors, they'll have a very clear idea of what they're spending, or one of the two partners in the partnership will, husband or wife. So I can only say to you, start with a clean sheet and talk to a client about what they're spending now and what do they think, or what is the expenses they'll have when they go into the new loan. Okay, cross-check the customer identified living expenses from independent sources such as accounts. We've all talked about that thus far. Just down the bottom, a helpful hint. There are a number of applications that we've talked about and I referred to before, bankstatements.com, CashDeck and Mogo, which is an Equifax product. We do have some information on those and the issue is though that's a cost to you as a credit representative or as a licensee holder if you're wanting to get into those sorts of facilities. But they do provide good avenues of verification. Document and communicate your expense estimate. It again just gets back to good practice. If you're completing a file note, if you're completing assessment of a client's actual living expenses, document how you verified it. It just has to be in dot point form. That you've used a rates notice or you've used a bank statement to verify, and keep them on file. Unfortunately, it's going to mean a lot more taking of paper, scanning onto the system than we've ever had to do in the past. In fact, it's a bit of back to the future for those of you who have been around lending for as long as I have. Which dates back to about 1983, might I say. We're really having to do what we didn't do in the early 2000s prior to GFC, where there was a lot of taken for granted figures that were being taken. we now have to verify far better than we've done in the past. Provide your client with a copy of the agreed CILE at the end. Make sure your client's comfortable with the figures that you're using. Best practice is also to provide a copy of the preliminary assessment. At that time, you've got to provide a copy of a preliminary assessment when asked by the borrower. A lot of brokers and credit assistance providers nowadays are providing the preliminary assessment as a matter of course up front. Okay, the law says you've got to provide it within 7 years of closing of a loan account. Another silly reverse law, if you like. If you provide it up front, then the client has full knowledge of how you've assessed their loan. It's good practice to get into. Ensure that the final CILE is the amount you declare to the lender through Apply Online, in the loan application, and in the lender's servicing calculator. If the CIL is lower than the lender's HEM, include the explanation. I can only emphasise that point, that you need to either reassess your CILE and see if you've taken all the right figures, or put a reason as to why it's lower than HEM. So I've probably raced through the end of that a little quickly, but I'll use the next 10 minutes or so to ask if there's any particular questions. Or Paul,
we've got quite a lot.
We've got quite a lot of questions here, but maybe we might run through a few that we can answer online now.
Yeah, look, the question about discretionary and non-discretionary is prompted a lot of discussion online while we've been having the webinar, and there's a lot of specific examples that have been raised, and I think that's a fantastic way for us to have to expand on that conversation around discretionary and non-discretionary. And from the example of, I've taken a $10,000 holiday, but I understand that when I move into my new property and have to pay the loan, I might not be able to take that $10,000 holiday every year or every 2 years. Right down to someone said, you know, do I buy ice cream or not? So I think what we'll do is we'll make a bit of a case study out of your various examples to come up with some more targeted thoughts on how to treat discretionary versus non-discretionary. I must say though, I do agree with the overall assessment that, you know, that people will, and we all know this, will tend to pay their home loan first, and they will tend to make adjustments to their lifestyle to make payment to their home loan. So we'll come back to you with something on that.
I would say, Paul, that that's a good example when you're talking about what people are spending on annual holidays. No use putting down now that, yeah, I've been for a $10,000 or $20,000 holiday overseas this year, so I should put that down in my living expenses. That is clearly discretionary and can and is changed depending on a client's borrowings. Yeah, I think it's good to put down some examples, and we'll do that in the FAQs as we go forward.
The other thing that there's a lot of discussion about is why then, if we're moving to this consideration more so around customer identified living expenses versus HEM, if we've done a very thorough job of confirming the customer identified living expenses and it happens to be below HEM, why will the lender go to the higher benchmark? Well, there's two aspects to this. One, you have an obligation under responsible lending to come up with the customer identified living expenses as part of your preliminary assessment. So that stands independent to the lender. And of course, the lender in their individual servicing calculator, you know, can take the option to use the higher of the two as part of their calculator. I think that would be in the category of APRA saying that, you know, that is providing a buffer against the information collected. I suppose the other thing is that, you know, pertinent to the questions that you've been asking, is this is really a developing conversation. It's a developing understanding, and we're working hard as an industry to perfect and improve the way we collect this information. But I suppose in the interim, the fallback to the higher of the two could be considered a prudent approach. I'm not sure that fully answers your question. The other question that's come up a couple of times is how can we find the HEM for a particular lender? There's no such thing as a standard level of HEM or a standard HEM matrix or amount for a lender. There's a number of criteria: location, state, income level, marital status that goes in. That can be a sliding scale. Each lender will assess the HEM amount that they apply under their own independent guidelines. So there's no one way of publishing what HEM is, but I think Steve talked about earlier some tips on how you can identify that through the Connective capacity calculator, at least to help.
It's the only way that that you can is where the calculators show the either or, CILE or the HEM. Lenders protect their calculators very, very guardedly, and that's for a reason. It's so they can't be manipulated. It's so people can't manipulate the outcomes of expenditure versus income. So unfortunately, there's no published tables, if you like, of HEM, or there is published tables, but the lenders will refine HEM to better suit their calculators in terms of their responsible lending obligations, and that goes to interest rate buffers and rate ceilings and all those sorts of things. So what you may be able to ascertain from the Melbourne Institute as being guidance on HEM tables may not be what each lender does in their own calculators and their assessment of HEM.
Just a couple of things to finish off. I got a question here from Alex asking if they're buying a property, do we need to include the rent that they're currently paying as part of their expenses? The answer is no. If they're ceasing rent because they're moving into a new home, then you don't need to include that for the go forward. And we really are running out of time. I'd like to thank Karen Corrie, because Karen, you've been wonderful with the amount of commentary that you've put in. And I agree, it doesn't matter how much work we do as brokers, as an industry and lenders. Unfortunately, my experience working for lenders is that most times when there's a problem with loans, it's because there's been a life event that's happened after the loan has been written by yourself. So at some point down the track, 12 months, 2 years, 5 years, someone loses a job or someone has a health issue, and that leads to them having problems making their repayments. All we can say is you can just do the best you can with the information you can collect and verify from your client. Of course, asking if there's anything about their situation that may change in the future, but most people won't know these things.
Living expenses, as Paul's mentioned, just in closing, is a bit of a moving feast. It'll continue to be a moving feast. I think for the balance of this year, especially whilst we've got the outcomes of the Royal Commission not due until September for preliminaries and February for the finals. So it's a bit of watch this space. We'll try and at Connective in the compliance world and the sales world deliver as much information to you as we can. We'll try and help you, do what you do best in advising your clients. And in fact, we are working at the moment on updating and improving the needs analysis questionnaire to allow you to better see where differences may be in terms of pre-verification, post-verification of your client's identified living expenses, so that phase one of your discussions with your clients may be raw data in those categories. You go through and do verifications and you find out it's different, and then you can go back and have a conversation with your clients as to why you're seeing those differences on the verifications. So everybody, thank you. We've had a huge attendance today, about 350 to 400 people coming in and dialing in. So I'm looking forward to seeing the questions. I haven't been able to see them through the seminar, but we'll come back to you with some outcomes and responses to all of those. If you've got any further questions, as we're seeing in our last slide here, whoops, sorry about that. Let's try and bring that up again. I've gone all the way through without any technical difficulties, Paul.
Yeah, we had to have one. It's Steve's first webinar with Connective, and I think he's done a pretty good job.
Thanks, Paul. We'll find out by some of the questions that are coming through, I suppose. But be kind on me. As Paul said, it's my first. We can only get better. If you've got further questions, send us an email at thecompliance@connective.com.au. You can use some of the resources in Wiki, and there's some links down the bottom of the last page in there. CPDs, don't forget to update your CPD points for attending the webinar. Paul, what have we got, 3 points for this, is it? 1 point, sorry. So I'll clarify that, 1 point for this, but yeah, if you can go into Mercury, is it?
Yeah, if you use the Mercury Compliance tab PD register, you can put 1 point in for today. We will send a follow-up email along with the FAQs, yep. And in that we'll put some instructions about what you need to do for recording the CPD.
Yep. Also, this has been recorded today, so we'll send this out, or our marketing people down in Melbourne will send this out in the next weekly Connective News Bulletin. So if you're wanting to have a look at it again and listen to my dulcet tones, have a look at it in the News Bulletin. So, Paul, I think we'll sign it off for today. We're pretty well right on time at 2 o'clock. And I'd like to thank everybody for attending. Have a great day, and I look forward to talking to hopefully a lot of you as we go forward so that we can